A young woman, pregnant and alone, was browsing for her unborn son's nursery essentials when she came face to face with her millionaire ex-husband and his new flame. What unfolded next was a tale so shocking no one could have possibly predicted it. The baby supply store was a haven of pastel colors and soft, quiet promises. The air carried the gentle scent of talcum powder and fresh cotton, a fragrance that soothed the soul and nurtured every mother's dreams. Imogen Adams, her hand resting over the prominent swell of her 5-month belly, felt a fragile calm as her fingers trailed along a row of minuscule rompers. Each tiny outfit was a quiet declaration of love for the baby growing inside her, an entire world she was building all by herself. She paused, weighing a trivial dilemma. The baby blue seemed too serene, the navy too serious. It was in this moment of simple, pure anticipation that the world around her completely fractured. A familiar laugh, a sound that had once been the very soundtrack to her happiness, sliced through the quiet. Slowly, she turned, her heart already thudding a frantic pre-warning against her ribs. And there he was, Edward Vincent, her ex-husband, the very architect of her loneliness. He wasn't by himself. On his arm, his hand resting possessively on her slender waist, was Clara Fielding, a tall, impeccably dressed woman in a crisp white blazer that screamed of power and sophistication. She was the absolute antithesis of everything Imogen felt in that moment. Clara's dark, straight hair fell like a cascade over her shoulders, and her smile was a perfect work of art, polished and brilliant, directed at something Edward was whispering in her ear. They looked like a couple from a glossy magazine, flawless and untouchable, utterly oblivious to the emotional catastrophe they had just unleashed just a few meters away. Imogen froze, the sky-blue romper forgotten in her hand. A desperate, overwhelming urge to merge with the shelves, to vanish behind a towering stack of blankets, consumed her. But her body simply refused to move. A toxic mix of shock, rage, and a profound, bone-deep pain pulsed in her ears. The brutal truth was a slow-acting poison. Edward had walked out on her 3 months after the joyous news of the pregnancy. His excuse was a pathetic, cowardly cliché about needing space, about finding himself. Apparently, he had found himself in the arms of someone else, and now fate, in its cruelest of ironies, had placed them in the very same aisle, the baby aisle. The realization hit her with the force of a sledgehammer. They weren't there by chance. They were shopping for baby essentials. Imogen's mind short-circuited, unable to process the tidal wave of questions that crashed through her heart. Clara was also pregnant. He had replaced her so completely, so quickly, that even the sacred experience of having a child was being replicated with another woman. Her shopping trolley became her only anchor, the cold metal handle digging into her trembling fingers. The world spun, and the store's soft colors blurred into an indistinct haze. She wanted to scream, to weep, to collapse right there on the shiny floor. But she did none of it. A strength she didn't know she had held her upright, silently watching. It was Clara who noticed her first. Her icy blue eyes swept over Imogen, a slow, judging scrutiny that took in her simple clothes, her bare face, her belly that was a living, breathing testament to a story they were trying so hard to erase. Clara subtly nudged Edward's arm. He turned. The smug, confident smile on his lips died the instant he saw her. His jaw tightened, and his eyes, which had once gazed at her with adoration, now held a cutting coldness, as if she were a total stranger who'd just intruded upon his perfect new world. "Imogen, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone completely hollow, devoid of any warmth or concern. The question was so absurd that a bitter laugh threatened to escape Imogen's lips. What did he think a pregnant woman was doing in a baby store? But the words were trapped in her throat, strangled by the pain of his sheer indifference. Clara stepped forward, a condescending smile playing on her crimson lips. "Ah, so you're the ex," she said, the word ex dripping with a sweet venom, as if it defined Imogen's entire existence. The jab was a deliberate provocation, a way to test her, to reassert her place as the victor. Imogen ignored her and focused on Edward, the man who had promised to love her through sickness and health, through joy and sorrow. She lifted her chin, her hand protectively over her abdomen. "I'm buying clothes for my son, Edward, our son," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, each word a tiny victory over the fear that consumed her. His eyes flickered down to her belly for a fraction of a second, a fleeting glimpse of something that might have been guilt, before he quickly averted his gaze, as if the truth were too unbearable to face. He said nothing. His silence was a confession, a cowardly denial of the child he had helped create. In that moment, Imogen understood. The battle was no longer just about her broken heart. It was about her son's place in the world, a place his own father seemed determined to deny. That scene in the baby store was the absolute tipping point, a wound that was ripped open and refused to heal. In the weeks that followed, Imogen sank into a period of deep, silent mourning. The memories of his abandonment ambushed her at the most unexpected times. The image of Edward packing his bags, refusing to meet her eyes, his hollow words about confusion and pressure echoing in the now empty apartment. He had walked out on a Tuesday morning, and with him he took the future they had planned together. From that day on, loneliness became her constant companion. She went to all her doctor's appointments alone, clutching the ultrasound images with trembling hands, trying to memorize every tiny detail to one day describe to her baby. She secretly treasured the powerful rhythm of his tiny heart, a miracle she was witnessing with no one beside her to share the joy. The nursery, which should have been a joyful project for two, became her lonely solo therapy. She painted the walls a soft sage green, assembled the cot piece by piece with the help of online tutorials. Each screw tightened a firm declaration of her ability to move forward. But the pain was always there, reflected in the pitying eyes of her neighbors and in the well-meaning but agonizing questions from relatives. "And Edward? Isn't he coming to see the nursery?" Each question was a fresh stab. It was in this fragile state that an ivory envelope with her name beautifully written in gold script arrived in the mail. It was an invitation to the wedding of Lara, Edward's cousin. Lara and Imogen had always shared a genuine bond, a connection that went beyond her relationship with Edward. Imogen's first impulse was to throw the invitation straight in the bin. The thought of facing the entire Vincent family, of being the focus of hushed whispers, was absolutely terrifying. But then a new, fierce resolve began to harden in her chest. Why should she hide? Why should she give up the connections she still cherished just because of his cowardice? She would go, not for him, not to confront him, but for herself, for her own dignity. She called the local dressmaker and asked for a fitting for an emerald green silk dress she'd had for a long time. It was a dress that would now lovingly hug and highlight the curve of her belly, transforming what some might see as a symbol of abandonment into a powerful emblem of life and strength. The day of the wedding arrived under a dramatically cloudy sky, mirroring the tempest inside her. As she entered the event space, a stunning ballroom adorned with opulent arrangements of white flowers and golden accents, Imogen felt all eyes turn to her. The green dress made her stand out in the crowd, and her belly was a radiant beacon. She walked with her head held high, her heart pounding, but her steps were steady. She found Lara, who hugged her with sincere affection, whispering, "You look incredible. I'm so happy you came." The comfort of that embrace was a balm for her soul. But the peace was fleeting. Across the room, she saw them arrive. Edward was dashing in a custom-made dark suit, and Clara wore a blood-red dress that seemed designed to capture every single eye. They walked arm in arm, smiling and waving, the very picture of manufactured happiness. The conversations around her instantly changed tone. The whispers grew more audible. Imogen could feel the curious and pitying stares on her. The couple approached the group where she was standing, and the tension became thick. Clara, with her talent for subtle cruelty, seized her chance. "It's such a lovely night to celebrate new beginnings, don't you think?" she said, looking directly at Imogen, her smile never faltering. The insinuation was sharp and clear as a blade. And Edward? He remained completely silent, a passive bystander, exactly as he always did when he wanted someone else to do his dirty work. His silence was louder than any insult. It was the confirmation of his complicity, his unspoken approval of her humiliation. In that gilded room, surrounded by familiar faces that now felt like strangers, Imogen felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the icy chill of being dismissed, of being utterly erased. She realized that to them, she was no longer a person. She was a problem to be ignored, a memory to be wiped away. And the war for her identity had only just begun. The wedding party was the final turning point, the push that sent her over the edge. In the days and weeks that followed, Imogen plunged into a period of profound darkness. The strength she had tried so hard to build around herself crumbled brick by brick. The nights became her enemy, bringing with them a relentless insomnia filled with nightmares, where she was running through endless corridors, desperate to reach an empty cot. Anxiety attacks ambushed her without warning in the middle of a supermarket or while driving, her chest tightening, the air growing thin, and panic swallowing her whole. She isolated herself from the world, cancelling lunch dates with the few friends who still insisted, and silencing her phone that buzzed with her mum's worried calls. The energy to pretend that she was fine simply ran out. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, became a cell. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the silence was filled only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. It was during this time that she started writing letters to her baby. In a hardcover notebook, she poured out everything she couldn't say aloud. They were raw confessions, filled with both fear and love. "My son," she wrote one night, tears smudging the ink. "Forgive me if Mum sometimes seems sad. It's just that the world out here is complicated. But I want you to know, from this very moment, that you are the most loved and most wanted thing that has ever happened to me, and I promise I'll be enough for both of us." Writing became her sole act of resistance, a way to connect with the future, to remind herself why she needed to keep fighting. Still, doubt continued to gnaw at her. What Edward and Clara had done wasn't just an act of betrayal, it was an act of complete erasure. They were replacing her, not just as a wife, but in her terrified mind, as if Clara could somehow steal her place as a mother. The idea was completely irrational, but pain doesn't follow logic. It was on a grey, rainy afternoon, when the Melbourne sky seemed to be weeping with her, that a firm and unexpected knock sounded at her door. Shivering, she dragged herself from the couch, her heart pounding with apprehension. When she opened the door, she was faced with a face from the past. Rhys Miller, Edward's ex-business partner and once his friend. He was absolutely drenched, his dark hair plastered to his head, and his eyes held a heavy burden that Imogen instantly recognized as guilt. "Imogen, I'm so sorry to show up like this," he said in a low, serious voice. "But there are things you need to know, things Edward did and is still planning to do." She let him in, her body tight with mistrust and fear. Rhys didn't mince words. Sitting on the edge of the sofa, he laid out the brutal truth. Edward hadn't just left her for Clara. He was in deep financial trouble with debts and accusations of fraud in the company they'd shared. Rhys had confronted him, and Edward, instead of taking responsibility, chose to run, using his new relationship with a powerful investor's daughter as a pathway to escape and financial salvation. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. "It's not just that, Imogen," Rhys continued, his voice filled with urgency. "He doesn't just want to get rid of the past. He wants to steal your future." Rhys then revealed the monstrous plan. Edward, with the help of Clara and some unethical lawyers, was compiling a file to have Imogen declared emotionally unstable. Based on this, he planned to seek full custody of the baby before its birth. He was using her depression and isolation, the direct consequences of his abandonment, as a weapon against her. Rhys took a USB drive from his bag. Here's the proof. Email exchanges between him and the lawyers and conversations with Clara where she's already talking about taking over the child's upbringing to give him a stable home. He even paid for a report from a psychologist who's never even met you in his life. He genuinely thinks you're too broken to fight back. Imogen's world disintegrated, and then, in that very instant, began to rebuild. The pain was excruciating, a betrayal on a level she couldn't have even imagined. He hadn't just wanted to leave her. He wanted to destroy her, to erase her existence and to steal the only thing she had left, her son. For a long time, she couldn't breathe. But then, in the absolute rubble of her heart, something new and ferocious was ignited. It was no longer just sadness or grief. It was a cold, clear, and determined fury. The news that should have annihilated her, in fact, brought her back to life. She looked at the USB drive in her hand, that tiny plastic object that contained so much poison, but also held her salvation. She wasn't a defenseless victim. She was a mother, and a mother was about to go to war. The awakening was like resurfacing from a long drowning. The apathy that had held her captive vanished, replaced by a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in months. The first person she called was her mum, Elaine. Hearing her daughter's voice, no longer fragile and whispering but firm and resolute, Elaine didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'm on my way." Elaine arrived in less than an hour, bringing not just a shopping bag with hot bread and fresh fruit, but also the calm and unshakable strength that had always defined her. She didn't offer words of pity or empty advice. Instead, she sat down next to Imogen at the kitchen table, took her hand, and said, "What are we going to do first?" The word "we" was the anchor Imogen desperately needed. She was no longer alone. Together, mother and daughter, they drew up a battle plan. The first step was finding the right legal team. Not just any lawyer, but someone who understood the psychological war they were in. The name that came up was Layla Nelson, a renowned family law barrister known for her relentless approach and fierce defense of women in vulnerable situations. Getting an emergency consultation wasn't easy, but Elaine was persistent, and the mention of litigation fraud and parental alienation opened doors. Layla's office was modern and formidable, an environment that radiated competence. The barrister, a woman with short, grey-streaked hair and piercing eyes, listened to Imogen's story without interruption, her face a mask of concentration. Imogen handed her the USB drive that Rhys had given her. As the barrister plugged the device into her computer and analyzed the files, the silence in the room was dense. Imogen watched the tiny expressions on Layla Nelson's face. A slight arch of an eyebrow, a subtle tightening of the lips. Finally, the barrister leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, and looked at Imogen. "This isn't just a custody dispute, Imogen. This is an attempt at character assassination. It's cruel, it's premeditated, and thankfully for us, it's all brutally documented." For the first time in months, Imogen felt a wave of hope. "What they didn't count on," Layla continued, "is that you'd have access to this. They completely underestimated you. They thought you'd be so devastated you'd just accept any scraps. That's the classic mistake of the arrogant." From that day on, Imogen's life found a new rhythm. Under Layla's guidance, she began to build her counter-offensive. The dossier Edward was compiling against her would be overshadowed by the one they would compile against him. Every move was meticulously planned. Imogen underwent a full psychological evaluation with an expert psychologist recommended by her lawyer, a professional who documented not only her anguish, but also her resilience and her deep connection to her pregnancy. She gathered testimonials. Her cousin Lara, who could attest to the nature of their relationship and the affection that had always existed. Neighbors who had looked out for her and her apartment. And even the dressmaker who had adjusted her dress. Subtle proof that she wasn't hiding from the world. Every medical record, every receipt from the baby store, every message exchanged with her mother became a piece of the armor they were forging. Reese's USB drive was their sword. While the legal battle was taking shape behind the scenes, Imogen was fighting another, more intimate one. Rebuilding herself. With Elaine's support, she started taking care of her health again, going for gentle walks in the park and practicing prenatal yoga. She redecorated the nursery for Benson. The name she chose meant blessed, no longer with a sense of defiance, but with pure, unadulterated joy. Every detail, from the star mobile to the soft rug, was a celebration of the life that was to come. A life she would protect with every fiber of her being. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and no longer saw an abandoned woman. She saw a warrior. Her prominent belly was no longer a reminder of betrayal, but her shield, the center of her newfound strength. She was fighting not just for herself, but for him. And that profound realization gave her a power Edward could never hope to understand. The hearing was scheduled. Layla Nelson's strategy was audacious. Instead of waiting for Edward to attack, they would preempt him, filing for a protective order and temporary unilateral custody based on the evidence of manipulation. They would walk into court not as the accused, but as the plaintiffs. On the night before the hearing, anxiety tried to creep in, but Imogen fought it with a newfound calm. She spent the night reading to Ben, her soft voice pushing back the silence of the apartment, her hand over her belly, feeling his gentle movements, as if he were telling her that he was right there with her. On that night, she understood that a victory in court would be important, but the true victory was already taking place inside her. She had found herself not in the arms of another person, but in her own strength. The day in court was a blur of tension and adrenaline. The courthouse, with its cold, echoing hallways, was an intimidating stage. Imogen saw Edward and Clara across the hall. He looked pale, his usual arrogance replaced by a poorly disguised apprehension. Clara, by his side, maintained a facade of confidence, but her eyes darted nervously in every direction. They looked smaller, less powerful, under the cold, impersonal light of justice. When they entered the hearing room, a small, stuffy space, the air became heavy. Edward's lawyer began his argument, painting a picture of Imogen as an unstable, depressed woman, incapable of raising a child. He presented the purchased psychological report, citing emotional outbursts and erratic behavior. Imogen felt her blood boil, but a reassuring touch from Layla on her arm kept her centered. Then it was Layla's turn. She stood, calm and methodical, and began to dismantle the farce piece by piece. First, she presented the report from the expert who had evaluated Imogen, a robust document that described a woman going through a comprehensible grief, but who was psychologically sound and extremely fit for motherhood. Next, she called the psychologist who had signed Edward's report to the stand. Under Layla's sharp cross-examination, the man stammered, contradicted himself, and finally admitted that he had never met Imogen, basing his diagnosis only on third-party accounts, in this case, Edward's. The judge, a man with a severe expression, made a note in his notebook, his face a grim frown. The final, crushing blow came with the evidence from the USB drive. Layla Nelson asked for permission to play an audio recording. Clara's voice filled the room, metallic and cruel. "You have to push harder, Edward," it said. "Say she threatened you, that she has meltdowns. We need to get her kid as soon as possible to give him a real home. I'll take care of everything, you know." The silence that followed was deathly. Clara went white as a sheet, her eyes wide with panic. Edward sank into his chair, his face in his hands. He didn't look at Imogen. He couldn't. His mask had fallen, revealing the true ugliness underneath. The judge looked at the couple with visible contempt. He didn't need anything more. The hearing was adjourned. The decision, he announced, would be swift. As they left the room, Edward passed Imogen, a defeated man. His silence, which had once been a weapon of humiliation, was now the sound of his complete surrender. Imogen felt no triumph, not even hatred. She felt only the deep, exhausted relief of someone who had survived a long and terrible war. The judge's decision came out later that afternoon. It was even more than Layla Nelson had hoped for. Unilateral custody was granted to Imogen, with a fair child support payment established. All of Edward's accusations were dismissed and classified as bad faith litigation. And to top it off, the judge ordered a criminal investigation to be opened against Edward for litigation fraud and against the psychologist for falsifying documents. The victory was total and overwhelming. Imogen wept in the car on the way home. It was a cry that wasn't born of sadness, but of freedom. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of everything. Months later, on a beautiful spring night, Imogen's water broke. The labor was long and challenging, but she was never alone. Her mum, Elaine, held her hand throughout the entire process, a constant and calming presence. And at 3:17 a.m., Benson came into the world with a strong cry and healthy lungs. When the nurse placed him in her arms, the outside world simply vanished. There was only the warmth of that tiny body against hers, the scent of new life, the miniature eyes that opened to meet hers. It was a love so devastating, so pure, that it healed all her remaining wounds. In that hospital room, holding her son, Imogen knew that everything she had been through was absolutely worth it. Edward never showed up. His absence, which would have once devastated her, was now the greatest gift. Ben would have a start in life free of toxicity, surrounded only by love. Life settled into a new and happy rhythm. The sleepless nights, the nappy changes, the lullabies whispered in the dark. Every moment was precious. Imogen found a strength she never knew she possessed, an infinite patience, and a joy that blossomed from the simplest things. Ben's first smile, the way his tiny fingers wrapped around hers. One day, while organizing some papers, she found the journal where she had written letters to her son during her darkest days. She read it, not with pain, but with a new perspective. She saw the journey of a woman who had been broken and who, all on her own, put her own pieces back together and rebuilt herself even stronger. And it was then that a new idea was born. She couldn't keep that experience to herself. There were other women out there feeling invisible, broken, and silenced. She needed to reach them. With the help of some friends and the support of a local community center, she created a support group. The name was simple and powerful, Forged by Fire. The first meeting had only 5 women, all with stories of pain, betrayal, and manipulation. Sitting in a circle, they shared their experiences, many for the very first time. Imogen told her own story, unfiltered and unashamed. She spoke of the baby store, the wedding, the court hearing, but most of all, she spoke of the rebirth. "They tried to extinguish us," she said, looking into each woman's eyes. "But they failed, because what they don't understand is that you don't extinguish a woman. When they try, she doesn't just disappear. She is forged. The fire didn't consume us. It tempered us." In that moment, seeing the tears of recognition and the smiles of hope around her, Imogen understood her true purpose. The victory against Edward wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her mission. She built a new life, not on the ashes of the old, but from the hardened metal that had emerged from the flames. A life that was strong, free, and finally full of light. News about the Forged by Fire group spread organically, by word of mouth, in online forums and in whispers of encouragement. What had started with 5 women in a borrowed room soon transformed into a vibrant community. Imogen, who had never imagined herself as a leader, discovered a natural ability to nurture and empower. She didn't offer magical solutions, but something far more valuable. A safe space for the validation of pain and the celebration of resilience. The meetings were a rich tapestry of stories, some whispered with choked-up voices, others told with a righteous and healing anger. There were women who, like her, had faced abandonment during pregnancy. Others were fighting to break free from emotionally abusive relationships. Still others were simply trying to rebuild their self-esteem after years of being belittled and controlled. In every story, Imogen saw a fragment of herself, and in her story, they saw the possibility of a different future. She divided her time between caring for Ben, who was growing right before her eyes, turning into a curious and joyful little boy, and her volunteer work with the group. Her life was full, not in a grand or glamorous way, but with a fullness built from the small moments, the smell of morning coffee as Ben babbled on her lap, the deep satisfaction of seeing a woman in the group raise her head and speak in a firm voice for the first time, being able to sleep with a tired but peaceful heart. The legal case against Edward was still ongoing in the courts, a distant echo of a life that no longer felt like hers. Layla Nelson handled everything with quiet efficiency, updating her only when necessary. The investigation into the fraud at Edward's old company had dug deeper, revealing a chain of corruption far more complex than Reese had ever imagined. Clara's and her father's names were also dragged into the scandal, not as direct accomplices, but as beneficiaries of a scheme that was now under the scrutiny of the financial media. One day, while pushing Ben's pram through a sunny park, Imogen ran into Reese Miller. He looked older, with eyes that gave away sleepless nights, but his gaze had a new lightness. He smiled when he saw her, a genuine smile, without the weight of guilt. "He's huge," he said, pointing to Ben, who was trying to grab a falling leaf. "He's my whole world," Imogen replied. The simplicity of the phrase carried the entire weight of her journey. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of the pram wheels on the gravel being the only soundtrack. "I wanted to thank you again, Reese. You didn't have to do what you did. You risked a lot." He shrugged, his eyes lost in the horizon. "I had to. For years I watched Edward manipulate people, use his charm to get what he wanted, always leaving a trail of damage that he never looked back to see. I was complicit in my silence. What he did to you was the final straw. I couldn't be the loyal friend of a man without honor anymore." It was a matter of saving myself too. The conversation led them to a nearby cafe. While Ben slept peacefully in his pram, Reese told her about the consequences of his decision. He had completely broken away from the social circle he shared with Edward, facing the distrust of former business associates. But in the process, he had rediscovered his own values. He was starting over with a smaller, more ethical company and a peace of mind that money couldn't buy. "And you?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You seem different. Not just good. You seem strong." Imogen smiled. "I am strong. I just didn't know it. I think I needed someone to try and destroy me to find out what I'm made of." That afternoon, a new friendship solidified. A friendship born not of convenience or shared stories of parties and dinners, but from a crisis that revealed the true character of both of them. Life, however, has a way of bringing the past back when you least expect it. A few weeks later, Imogen received a call from an unknown number. It was Lara, Edward's cousin. Her voice was tense and hesitant. "Imogen, I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but my aunt, Edward's mum, isn't well. Ever since all this came out, her health has gotten much worse. She asks about you. She always really liked you." Imogen felt a knot in her stomach. Sonia, her ex-mother-in-law, had always been a kind woman, though a bit passive in the face of her son's domineering personality. She was faced with a dilemma. Visiting Sonia would mean reopening a door to the family that had hurt her so much. But ignoring the request of a sick woman seemed cruel. After talking to her own mother, who wisely told her, "Do what your heart tells you, not what your head says," Imogen made a decision. She went to the hospital the next day without Ben. She found Sonia in a private room, pale and fragile, connected to monitors that beeped softly. Seeing Imogen, the older woman's eyes filled with tears. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice weak. "You were always the only one with a truly good heart in that family." Imogen sat down next to the bed, holding Sonia's cold hand. They didn't talk about Edward, or the lawsuit, or Clara. They talked about simple things, about the rose garden Sonia loved so much, about the color of Ben's eyes. But before Imogen left, Sonia held her with a surprising strength. "He wasn't like that, you know. Or maybe he always was, and I didn't want to see it. I pampered him. I protected him too much. But I failed him, and that's why he failed you. Forgive me, my dear. Forgive me for the pain my son caused you." Sonia's tears were of a deep regret, the pain of a mother who recognized her part in creating the monster. Imogen hugged her. And in that embrace, she didn't just forgive Edward, she freed herself from the last bit of anger she still held for that family. She left the hospital feeling lighter, as if she had finally cut the last anchor tethering her to the past. Meanwhile, Edward's empire was publicly collapsing. News of the fraud became a national scandal, irreparably staining the Vincent family name. Clara's father, dedicated to saving his own skin, issued an official statement cutting all professional and personal ties with Edward, claiming to have been misled by the trust he placed in a future family member. The engagement, which was never made official with a ring but rather with appearances in society columns, was undone in a whisper of humiliation. Clara disappeared from the spotlight, her image as a powerful, victorious woman replaced by that of a foolish socialite who had been used and discarded. Rumors said she had moved overseas, seeking the anonymity she had once despised. Edward's final trial was scheduled, not the family trial, which was already over, but the criminal one. Imogen was called as a witness, not for the fraud itself, but for his pattern of manipulative behavior. Her testimony, delivered with a calm and clarity that impressed the court, was the final piece that connected his financial dishonesty to his moral dishonesty. She didn't accuse him with anger. She simply presented the facts, the chronology of how he had tried to use the legal system to silence her and steal her child. It was devastating in its simplicity. Edward, sitting in the defendant's chair, looked like a shadow of the man he once was. The expensive suit couldn't hide how shrunken he was, the sparkle in his eyes replaced by a dull fear. He was sentenced to years in prison, a sentence that included not only the financial crimes, but also the litigation fraud against her. Justice, slow and sometimes painful, had finally prevailed. On the night the sentence was announced, Imogen didn't celebrate. She put Ben to sleep, sat in the armchair in his room, and watched the fine rain fall outside. She didn't feel joy at Edward's downfall, but a deep and solemn relief. It was the end, the final period of a story that had taken her to hell and back. She thought of all the women forged by fire, of their own battles, of their own silent victories. Her story was just one of many, but now she had a platform to turn her pain into a beacon. She took out her notebook and began to write, not a letter to her son, but a draft for a bigger project, a book, an organization, a movement. She didn't know exactly what it would be, but she knew that her voice, the voice Edward had tried to silence, was only just beginning to be heard. The sound of the rain was like a soft applause, and for the first time in a long time, Imogen looked to the future and saw an infinite horizon of possibilities, an open sky that she had conquered all by herself. Time, from that point on, took on a new quality. It stopped being an enemy to be endured and became an ally, a craftsman who wove Imogen's and Ben's days with threads of normalcy and joy. Life unfolded into a tapestry of precious moments. Ben's first wobbly steps across the living room, the chubby hand pointing at the neighbor's dog, the first word, "Mama," said with a clarity that made Imogen's heart overflow. Every milestone in her son's development was a personal victory, living proof that the love and stability she had worked so hard to build were flourishing. The apartment, once a scene of loneliness and fear, now echoed with a child's laughter and the sound of building blocks tumbling to the floor. It was the sound of life in its purest and most glorious form. The Forged by Fire group also grew and evolved. Imogen, with the help of other women who had become pillars of the community, began to organize practical workshops, family law basics with volunteer lawyers, financial literacy classes for women who needed to regain their independence, and group therapy sessions with partnering psychologists. The project that had been born from her pain was becoming a tangible force for change in the lives of many. She discovered a talent for organization and a passion for connecting people and resources. Seeing a woman get a protective order, another get a job, another simply smile with genuine ease for the first time in years, brought Imogen a deep satisfaction, a sense of purpose that no previous professional success had ever given her. She wasn't just healing herself, she was helping to build an army of women who refused to be victims. Her friendship with Reese deepened, becoming a constant and comforting presence in her life. He was Uncle Reese to Ben, always showing up with a new toy or an infinite patience for a game of hide and seek. For Imogen, he was a confidant, someone she could talk to openly about the challenges of being a single mum and the joys of watching her project grow. There was no romance between them, but something perhaps rarer and more precious, a mutual respect and a genuine affection forged in honesty and in overcoming a shared crisis. He encouraged her to take Forged by Fire to the next level, to seek funding, to formalize the organization. What you've created, Imi, is bigger than you know, and it needs to reach more people. The idea for the book, born on a rainy night, began to take shape. Imogen spent the late nights after Ben was asleep, writing. It wasn't an autobiography to expose her wounds, but a guide, a manifesto. She wove her story with those of other women from the group, anonymously and with permission, creating a mosaic of experiences that illustrated the tactics of emotional manipulation, the challenges of the legal system, and, most importantly, the paths to reconstruction. The writing was a cathartic and demanding process. Reliving certain moments was painful, but now she did so from a position of power, analyzing the events with the distance of a survivor, not with the anguish of a victim. The title she chose was Forged from Silence to Sentence. One day, while researching publishers, she came across the name of an editor-in-chief at a small but respected publishing house focused on female voices and impactful non-fiction. The name was familiar: Brooke Andrews. She was a former university colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, but whose intelligence and determination she had always admired. With a mix of nervousness and audacity, Imogen sent an email attaching the first 3 chapters of her manuscript. "Hi, Brooke. You probably don't remember me, but we were in the same class. A lot has happened since then. I think I've written a book you might be interested in." The response came in less than 24 hours. "Imogen? Of course I remember you. I read what you sent in one sitting. I'm speechless. We need to talk. Urgently." The meeting with Brooke was a whirlwind. The editor not only loved what she read, but saw the potential for something much bigger. "This isn't just a book, Imogen, it's a movement. Your voice is authentic, your story is powerful, and the way you've turned it into a tool for other women is brilliant. We're not just going to publish this, we're going to make some noise." The contract was signed. The editing process was intense but collaborative. Brooke helped Imogen refine her writing, organize the stories in an even more impactful way, and transform the manuscript into a polished work ready for the world. During this period, Imogen felt like an artist discovering a new medium of expression. The woman who had once been silenced was now about to have her voice printed and distributed in bookstores across the country. Meanwhile, the final chapter of Edward's saga was unfolding in prison. The news that reached her was sparse, through newspaper articles or comments from Lara, with whom Imogen still maintained sporadic contact. Apparently, life behind bars had stripped Edward of all his arrogance. Without his charm, his money, and his connections to manipulate the environment, he was just another number. A man who had lost everything. His mum, Sonia, passed away a few months after his sentencing. A final blow that, according to Lara, broke him in a way that even prison couldn't. He refused to receive visitors, isolating himself in a silence that, this time, was not a weapon, but a surrender. Imogen felt nothing upon hearing this news, neither pity nor satisfaction. Edward had become an irrelevant figure, a ghost from a distant past. Her energy was focused on the vibrant present and the promising future. The book launch was an event that exceeded all of Imogen's expectations. The bookstore was packed. Women from Forged by Fire, friends, family, journalists, and many unknown faces. Women who had read about the book and felt represented. Her mum, Elaine, was in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Reese was next to her, holding a slightly impatient Ben, who was smiling as he saw his mum on the small stage. When Imogen got up to speak, a wave of emotion washed over her. She looked at the crowd and didn't just see readers. She saw a congregation of survivors and allies. "Good evening," she began, her voice firm but filled with feeling. "A few years ago, I was in a baby store, feeling like the most invisible and broken woman in the world. I thought my story was over. Today, looking at each of you, I understand that that wasn't my story ending. It was my story beginning. This book is not about my pain. It's about our power. The power we discover when we refuse to be silenced, when we transform our scars into maps to guide other women out of the darkness. To every woman who has ever felt extinguished, discarded, or broken, you are not alone. You are not what they did to you. You are what you choose to become from now on. You are a force to be reckoned with. You are forged." A thunderous applause filled the bookstore, a sound that was more than just approval. It was a collective roar of recognition and power. That night, signing copies of her book, hearing the whispered stories of women who thanked her for giving a voice to their feelings, Imogen knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had found her place in the world. She was no longer Edward Vincent's ex-wife. She was Imogen Adams, author, activist, mother. And her true story was only just beginning to be written. The success of Forged was meteoric and surprising. The book not only sold well, but became a cultural phenomenon, a point of reference in discussions about abusive relationships and female empowerment. Imogen was invited to television shows, podcasts, and panels at universities. At first, the exposure made her nervous, but she quickly realized that every interview was an opportunity to broaden the message of Forged by Fire to an audience she might never reach otherwise. She learned to navigate this new world with the same grace and firmness that guided her in her personal life. Her authenticity was her greatest asset. She didn't speak in self-help jargon, but with the raw honesty of someone who had lived what she was preaching. With the book sales and public recognition came financial resources. For the first time, Imogen had more than enough to live comfortably. The first thing she did was buy a larger apartment in a leafy suburb with a small backyard for Ben to play in. It was a space she chose, paid for, and decorated herself. A home with no ghosts, only the promise of a happy future. Next, she invested most of her earnings into formalizing Forged by Fire. With the help of Reese, who offered his management expertise, and Layla Nelson, who handled the legal side, the support group transformed into the Forged Institute. The organization now had a headquarters, a team of paid professionals, psychologists, social workers, lawyers, and the capacity to offer free and structured support to hundreds of women. The dream that had been born in her small apartment was now a solid institution, a beacon of hope with a fixed address. Ben, now a boy of almost 4, was the gravitational center of her life. He was a happy, outgoing and affectionate child, blissfully unaware of the storm that preceded his birth. Imogen was careful to explain the absence of a father figure. She didn't lie, but adapted the truth to his age. "Daddy lives very, very far away, my love. But you have Mama, you have Nana Elaine and Uncle Reese and a whole bunch of people who love you more than anything in the world." She was determined to raise him without the poison of resentment, teaching him about respect, empathy, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Lessons that Edward had never learned. Her relationship with Reese continued to be a pillar of her life. Their friendship was easy, deep, and uncomplicated. They were the family they had chosen for each other, celebrating birthdays, taking care of each other on sick days, and sharing life's joys and frustrations. There was no romance between them, but something perhaps rarer and more precious, a mutual respect and a genuine affection forged in honesty and in overcoming a shared crisis. He encouraged her to take Forged by Fire to the next level, to seek funding, to formalize the organization. "What you've created, Imi, is bigger than you know, and it needs to reach more people." The idea for the book, born on a rainy night, began to take shape. Imogen spent the late nights after Ben was asleep, writing. It wasn't an autobiography to expose her wounds, but a guide, a manifesto. She wove her story with those of other women from the group, anonymously and with permission, creating a mosaic of experiences that illustrated the tactics of emotional manipulation, the challenges of the legal system, and, most importantly, the paths to reconstruction. The writing was a cathartic and demanding process. Reliving certain moments was painful, but now she did so from a position of power, analyzing the events with the distance of a survivor, not with the anguish of a victim. The title she chose was Forged from Silence to Sentence. One day, while researching publishers, she came across the name of an editor-in-chief at a small but respected publishing house focused on female voices and impactful non-fiction. The name was familiar: Brooke Andrews. She was a former university colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, but whose intelligence and determination she had always admired. With a mix of nervousness and audacity, Imogen sent an email attaching the first 3 chapters of her manuscript. "Hi, Brooke. You probably don't remember me, but we were in the same class. A lot has happened since then. I think I've written a book you might be interested in." The response came in less than 24 hours. "Imogen? Of course I remember you. I read what you sent in one sitting. I'm speechless. We need to talk. Urgently." The meeting with Brooke was a whirlwind. The editor not only loved what she read, but saw the potential for something much bigger. "This isn't just a book, Imogen. It's a movement. Your voice is authentic. Your story is powerful. And the way you've turned it into a tool for other women is brilliant. We're not just going to publish this. We're going to make some noise." The contract was signed. The editing process was intense but collaborative. Brooke helped Imogen refine her writing, organize the stories in an even more impactful way, and transform the manuscript into a polished work ready for the world. During this period, Imogen felt like an artist discovering a new medium of expression. The woman who had once been silenced was now about to have her voice printed and distributed in bookstores across the country. Meanwhile, the final chapter of Edward's saga was unfolding in prison. The news that reached her was sparse, through newspaper articles or comments from Lara, with whom Imogen still maintained sporadic contact. Apparently, life behind bars had stripped Edward of all his arrogance. Without his charm, his money, and his connections to manipulate the environment, he was just another number. A man who had lost everything. His mum, Sonia, passed away a few months after his sentencing, a final blow that, according to Lara, broke him in a way that even prison couldn't. He refused to receive visitors, isolating himself in a silence that, this time, was not a weapon, but a surrender. Imogen felt nothing upon hearing this news. Neither pity nor satisfaction. Edward had become an irrelevant figure, a ghost from a distant past. Her energy was focused on the vibrant present and the promising future. The book launch was an event that exceeded all of Imogen's expectations. The bookstore was packed. Women from Forged by Fire, friends, family, journalists, and many unknown faces. Women who had read about the book and felt represented. Her mum, Elaine, was in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Reese was next to her, holding a slightly impatient Ben, who was smiling as he saw his mum on the small stage. When Imogen got up to speak, a wave of emotion washed over her. She looked at the crowd and didn't just see readers. She saw a congregation of survivors and allies. "Good evening," she began, her voice firm but filled with feeling. "A few years ago, I was in a baby store, feeling like the most invisible and broken woman in the world. I thought my story was over. Today, looking at each of you, I understand that that wasn't my story ending. It was my story beginning. This book is not about my pain. It's about our power. The power we discover when we refuse to be silenced, when we transform our scars into maps to guide other women out of the darkness. To every woman who has ever felt extinguished, discarded, or broken, you are not alone. You are not what they did to you. You are what you choose to become from now on. You are a force to be reckoned with. You are forged." A thunderous applause filled the bookstore, a sound that was more than just approval. It was a collective roar of recognition and power. That night, signing copies of her book, hearing the whispered stories of women who thanked her for giving a voice to their feelings, Imogen knew without a shadow of a doubt that she had found her place in the world. She was no longer Edward Vincent's ex-wife. She was Imogen Adams, author, activist, mother, and her true story was only just beginning to be written.